We have a very extensive agenda for today, and I've basically put it down here. So it's a continuation of my lecture from Tuesday, and what we're going to be covering today is the later phase of nationalism, the Swadeshi movement as it's called. Of course, I'll interpret and describe all of that for you. The emergence of Gandhi, and the idea of nonviolent resistance, and the transformation of the Congress, the Indian National Congress, the organization which was founded in 1885 into a organization advocating mass nonviolent resistance, and then the whole question of communalism, namely, that is to say, another way of speaking about the implications of the Hindu-Muslim divide, which was going to, of course, acquire increasing importance and then would eventually lead to the demand for the vivisection or division of India itself when India achieved independence in 1947. Now, the point at which I had terminated my last lecture was I'd been speaking to you about early nationalism. I'd been speaking about what the nationalists who created the Indian National Congress were demanding. Whether in fact one wants to call them nationalists at all is itself an interesting question, because they're certainly not advocating for complete independence of India. I don't think the conception of India as a nation state had really fully formed in their minds at this point in time. But nonetheless, as I pointed out, despite all the limitations, despite the fact that they had put forward very limited demands, and even those limited demands were in fact actually largely rejected by the British. Recall what some of those early limited demands were: that Indians should be allowed to join the army as commissioned officers, that there should be a much greater number of Indians in the legislative assemblies, in the council of the viceroy, and the executive council for each governor, the governor of Madras, for example, so forth and so on. That all of these demands, in fact, barring a couple of them, are really going to be rejected. But nonetheless, my claim was, and that's the point at which I want to now resume the narrative, the claim was that the moderates, as they're called, so these early nationalists are also called moderates. That's what I mean by that, by the use of the word. And when I say moderates, I'm speaking about people who are whose method of resistance, if one wants to call it that, in fact it's not really resistance as such, but if you want to call it that, it means that they actually write letters to the viceroy, to the governors, or to district officials. They petition them. They send petitions to the parliament in England. So they're working within what you might call constitutional means. All right, they're working within constitutional means, and these are largely elites. They're highly educated people. A greater number of them are actually lawyers, and they're professionals of other kinds. Right? So even though their demands fail, the argument was that they had raised awareness of the problem of racism and discrimination. And of course, it is their failure in part which is going to lead to other strands of nationalism, which will in fact now begin to emerge in full force. All right, so that's the point at which I had terminated my previous lecture. Now, the person I want to introduce at this juncture, before I continue the narrative of nationalism in an institutional sense as well, the person I want to introduce, of course, is Gandhi. Now, Gandhi is born in 1869. I want to actually move here very quickly to a different PowerPoint that I have, which is a PowerPoint that I use for my course on Gandhi. So I teach an entire course on Gandhi. So what you're going to be hearing today and tomorrow are really snippets of something that I spend about 25 hours on when I teach a course on Gandhi. All right. So Gandhi is born in 1869. He's born if you look at this over here, why don't we have this? Okay. Yeah. So if you look at this map over here, so this is Western India. This is the state of Gujarat. Here is Rajkot, and there's a place here called Porbandar. He's born in the coastal town of Porbandar on October 2nd, 1869. Now, Gandhi is a person who I'm sure all of you have some inkling of who he was, because he is generally known as the chief architect of the Indian independence movement, usually remembered, of course, as if I may put it this way, the prophet of nonviolence. You know, there are all kinds of descriptions that have been furnished of his importance. I think what we want to begin with is the context in which he grew up, all right? And the first thing to keep in mind is that he is actually born in a princely state. So the place that he is born in, Porbandar, is in fact not a part of British India. It is a native state. His father, this is by the way his birthplace in Porbandar, and this is the room where he was born. So you know, you don't get too many individuals in India for whom you have details of this kind, because this is obviously in some ways a national shrine. I might mention to you, by the way, that there are only 3 mandatory national holidays in India. So one is Republic Day, the other is Independence Day, and the third is the birthday of Mohandas Gandhi. All right, these are all photographs that I took when I went there a couple of years ago, and you know, the Porbandar now has become, as I said, a kind of a national shrine. Although the general norm in India is that when a place becomes a national shrine, it's a very good indication of the fact that the person is going to be entirely forgotten in a different way. So his teachings have all been completely rubbished. That would be the easiest way of describing the legacy of Gandhi in India today. This is his mother, and this is his father. All right. Now, the place where he grew up, Gujarat, was a place where the Vaishnava influence was quite predominant. So when I speak of the Vaishnava influence, what am I speaking about here? It's important to talk a little bit about this, because nonviolence didn't just drop from the trees. Right? The idea of nonviolent resistance, how did it really come to Gandhi? And that is, in fact, of course, in some ways, what he's known for principally. That doesn't mean that that's his only contribution, but we also have to, before I continue with this, we also have to think about the fact that he may have had predecessors in some sense of the term, but not entirely. So, for example, in the American context, you might want to think of Henry David Thoreau, right? Henry David Thoreau, an American essayist, one of the 2 principal figures in what is called American transcendentalism. Some of you may have read Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson in high school. And one of the essays that Thoreau wrote was an essay called On the Duty of Civil Disobedience. That's the exact title of his essay, On the Duty of Civil Disobedience. And I don't know how many of you recall the context for Thoreau's essay. The context was that there was the war going on between the United States and Mexico, and Thoreau refused to pay his taxes because he said that he would not permit his taxes to be used for an illegal purpose. And he was thrown into jail. He only spent 1 night in jail. That's another long story. But essentially what the essay argues is that your conscience is a higher law than any law created by the state. Now, he is a predecessor, and yet he isn't, for a great many reasons. And the principal reason, since we have to truncate this discussion and move on, the principal reason is that Thoreau was really only thinking of the moral conscience of the individual. He's not thinking of anything like how one might deploy the idea of nonviolence so that it can be used as a political instrument. And that's actually really not the kind of phrase I would want to use, but I'm using it for the sake of convenience, because for Gandhi, nonviolence is not simply a matter of being an instrument, which is better than other instruments. It's the law of your being, right? For him, nonviolence cannot be reduced simply to the matter of nonviolent resistance. Nonviolence is an ethical way of being in the world, an ethical way of living in the world. All right. So the principal difference I'm pointing out is that for Thoreau, the idea of resistance to unjust laws only extends to the individual. So each individual may decide that a particular law is unjust and may then decide to rebel in his or her own fashion. Gandhi, of course, is going to take this much, much further, not only because he's going to deploy an entire philosophy of nonviolence, as I've already indicated, but because, of course, he is going to then think about how one can create the grounds for political action which are ethical. Because if you had to put it in the simplest language in English, what is it that Gandhi is really doing? He's bringing in ethics into politics in a way which is really quite unprecedented, right? So but then if you look at the milieu that he comes from, that's very important because the area where he grew up was an area where the Vaishnava theology was predominant, and the Vaishnavas are a school of, I mean, there's very often in English it's called sect, but essentially the Vaishnavas, if I may put it in the simplest language once again, are those who advocate devotion. So there are many different ways that you can reach God, right? Even in Christian theology, for example, if you're a Lutheran, the notion of works, you know, Luther's idea of work. Right? The other way to reach God is through some kind of intellectual discrimination, as it were. Devotion. There's strands of mysticism, for example, in the West as well. So there are different ways in which you can reach God. The Vaishnavas basically stress what you might call devotion. The Vaishnavas also adhered to a number of other precepts, such as vegetarianism, for example, which was very important, and Gandhi was a lifelong vegetarian. Even more so than the Vaishnavas, you have the Jains. Gandhi is not a Jain. Jainism is another religion, by the way, which is indigenous to the Indian soil, like Hinduism and Buddhism. And Sikhism. So the Jains are those who adhere to a very rigid conception of nonviolence and very, very strict vegetarianism. So that cultural milieu and intellectual milieu is very important. All right, that's the first thing to think about when you're thinking about Gandhi. Now, Gandhi is going to go to school in Gujarat. He's going to go to school in Porbandar and to a place called Rajkot, which was on that map, which is about, let's say, about 200 kilometers from Porbandar, roughly. It is also important, incidentally, that Porbandar and Gujarat as a whole has a city of trading. So Gujarati merchants, as I think I've mentioned in passing in a different context, really circulated the world around the globe. They were to be found everywhere, Gujarati merchants, for centuries. And Gandhi himself comes from a kind of a trading family, you know, literally grocers, but his father was actually a political figure, not a major political figure, but he's a political figure. And it's a port city. And all of these things are very important if we're trying to understand the milieu from which Gandhi came, because, you know, ports are cities, port cities look outwards. There's the ocean there, and there's a world beyond, or there's a sea there, and there's a world beyond. And of course, the Gujaratis, as I said, were people who were highly diasporic. You know, so Los Angeles, by the way, has a huge, huge Gujarati population. All right. So that's another part of the milieu. And then, of course, some of the rest of that milieu you already have a sense of, right? Because I've talked about social reform movements and all of that, although many of these social reform movements hadn't really touched Gujarat in the same way in which they had touched, for example, you know, Bengal, all right, or Maharashtra. Now, Gandhi is going to leave for London once he has finished his schooling, and he's going to become credentialed as a lawyer when he goes to London. So he's going to spend 3 years there. He has an autobiography. You can read you know, about his sojourn in London, and there are extraordinary segments in that autobiography. The implications of his leaving, the consequences of his leaving for London. He spends 3 years there. He returns to India, tries to establish himself as a lawyer, but fails. And 1 year after his return to India, he leaves for South Africa, where he's going to spend over 20 years. Over 20 years. Why did he leave for South Africa? Well, again, there are a great many circumstances that we would have to think of, other than the fact that I mentioned that he hadn't really been able to make much of himself in India, so he was looking for another outlet, and one outlet he found was South Africa, because there was a Indian community there, a substantial Indian community. Now, you should be able to understand why there is a substantial Indian community in South Africa, largely because of the presence of Indian indentured laborers. Recall, right, what I mentioned to you, the outward migration of Indian indentured laborers. So South Africa itself, I think I have a slide over here if I can find it, which would give you, it might be later on, which would give you a little sketch of where he goes in South Africa. So if you look at this over here now, so this is South Africa 1860. Gandhi is going there, of course, a little bit later. He's going there, closer to, let's say, about 1890. So this is the Cape Colony. So at this point, South Africa, there was no Union of South Africa. You had the Cape Colony, and then you had the Transvaal, the Orange Free State, and the two major European groups that are present there are the British and the Dutch. Did you have a question?
Yeah, just at what point in his life did Gandhi write his autobiography?
Oh, that's much later, 1920s. 1920s, yeah. All right. So you've got the Transvaal, and you've got the Cape Colony, and you've got Natal. So you see Natal over here. So this is where you have Indian indentured laborers. What have they come to do? They've come to work on sugar plantations. Sugar plantations, right? By the way, what's the biggest killer in history? Sugar. By far, the biggest killer in history, right? If you think about it. No one thinks of it in that way. I mean, but if you look at, diabetes, obesity, and then if you look at the whole slave trade, because of course in the United States, in the Deep South, cotton plantations, but elsewhere, largely sugar, all over the Caribbean, right? Natal, Fiji, you name it, Brazil. Sugar, okay? Yeah, lots of places. So, but that's another story. Something for you to think about, how we think about commodities and what their histories are, and so on and so forth. So he comes to South Africa. So when I say South Africa, I really mean he's coming to Natal, right? And he's going to spend 20 years there. And his career there is, now at least, it is seen as highly controversial. If I had the luxury, once again, I would be happy to talk about it for hours on end. Why is his career seen as being controversial in South Africa today? And when I say controversial, I don't mean that the vast majority of people see it as controversial, but there's certainly some critics of his now. In order to understand that, we have to understand that, of course, that the Indians were a minuscule group in the larger scheme of things. In the larger scheme of things, they're still a minuscule group. The largest population, of course, is that of black South Africans, right? Black people, and then you have a tiered structure. There is no Union of South Africa right now, so it's not that you have an apartheid state officially. Of course, racism is prevalent, pervasive, but it's not institutionalized fully in the same sense in which it would be in the 20th century when South Africa officially becomes an apartheid state. So what you had was you have a four-tiered structure. The four-tiered structure is that the whites are on the top. Underneath the whites are the colored people, right? These are people who are mixed. And then you have the Indians, and then you have the black people, right? The indigenous black people. That's the four-tiered structure, racial structure of South Africa, okay? Now, Gandhi and the Indian community, it is very important to mention that. And again, all of this is important not simply because I'm trying to give you a brief biography. You can go to Wikipedia or maybe Encyclopedia Britannica or pick up one of the 10,000 biographies of Gandhi that have been written. But some of this has a resonance for what he's going to do in India, right? How does he achieve a mass movement? Where had he first tried out some of his ideas? That's why South Africa is important. Now, the Indian community there is not singular, meaning there are many Indian communities in South Africa. So you have the indentured laborers. The indentured laborers are largely from South India, and they are also and they're Tamil speakers and Telugu speakers, and then there are also those who come from North India, from the UP Bihar region, right, the Gangetic Plains region. But in addition to these, you have a Gujarati trading community. You have a Gujarati trading community. Right? And it is this Gujarati trading community on account of which Gandhi was able to come to South Africa, because there was a firm, a company that needed the services of a lawyer. And so these Gujaratis all came from places such as Porbandar and so on. And so through various contacts, they got hold of Mohandas, right, which is Gandhi's first name, and they finally are able to give him an offer, and he sails for South Africa. So when he comes there, he finds that there are actually multiple Indian communities, and he's going to find out soon enough that South Africa is a deeply racist country. And again, let me reiterate for the third or fourth time, when I say South Africa, I'm really talking here not about the Union, I'm talking about all of this, I'm talking about this physical area, because the Union of South Africa it wasn't one single country at that point in time, but all of this was constitutive of what would become the Union of South Africa. So he decides that he's going to stay back. He's on the verge of leaving for India. At least that's what he tells us in his autobiography. He's on the verge of leaving for India, and then he is alerted to the fact that the legislative assemblies of a number of these states have passed bills which discriminate against Indians. For example, Indian marriages were not viewed as legal. Now, that deeply offended somebody like Gandhi, because he said, well, basically what they've done is they've turned all of our women into prostitutes. Right, if none of these marriages are legal. There was also a poll tax placed upon Indians. So, you know, when Indians, so one of the, and this is a problem you're going to find everywhere where Indian indentured laborers had gone, that usually they went for a term of 5 years or something to that effect, and then when that lease is over, that agreement is over after 5 years, technically they're free, but there would be obstacles that would be put in the way for them to be able to reside wherever they had gone. Right? So this is what I mean when I speak about various kinds of hindrances and obstacles. Yes?
Was he inspired by the writings or the speeches of someone else, or like where did he develop this kind of conscientiousness about?
Well, you see, that's what I was trying to suggest. I mean, he's read people like Thoreau. He's read people like Thoreau, he's read people like Emerson, he's read John Ruskin, but that's a long history. The intellectual history of, you know, how Gandhi arrived where he is a very, very long subject. Yeah.
Just what was his responsibility as a lawyer for this company, you know, over there?
It's helping the company do legal transactions. You know, they have to, if they're working, you know, in that place, they have to be able to work within, you know, the business culture of that area, legal codes. It's again, you know, we want to make sure that we don't get detained by all of these particulars, because you want to keep in mind that we are looking at Gandhi here in relationship to what he's going to do in India. Okay, yeah.
Small thing, but so
yeah.
Can we then say that was South African, again, the region, was South African, the Cape Colony and these laws,
yeah.
were they similar to the laws in India? Because, you know, given that he was educated in London.
Yes and no. Yes and no. Because for example, restrictions on property ownership. No, you don't really get those laws in India. Indians are not restricted from owning property in India, but here they are. That would be one tangible difference. All right. One tangible difference is restrictions on mobility. Indian indentured laborers in order to be able to move anywhere, needed a pass. They needed a pass. Right? And there are severe restrictions on their mobility. There are obviously restrictions, as I've said, on property ownership, so forth and so on. Those would be some of the liabilities under which Indians are going to suffer in South Africa. And what Gandhi is going to do is that he's going to then stay behind, and he's going to eventually create an organization. It's going to be called the Natal Indian Congress. The Natal Indian Congress, right? So remember that parallel in India now is the Indian National Congress, and he's going to mobilize Indians. And it is in South Africa eventually that he's going to come up with the idea of satyagraha, right? So one of his major works is called Satyagraha in South Africa. And what is this? This is a neologism. This is a word that he invents. He takes two Sanskrit words, satya, which means truth, and agraha, which means force, right? So the force of truth. But here again, this is, philosophers and others who have worked on this have spent pages and pages trying to deconstruct the whole word and its meaning, because the root of this word is the word sat. That's the root, and sat means being, right? To be, from the verb to be, being. So what Gandhi is really saying is that when I confront my opponent with the force of truth, not with the force of arms or the force of violence, I'm actually confronting them with their own being. I am making them aware of who they are, in fact. Right? The philosophical underpinnings of this idea are, in fact, actually quite complex. For your purposes, it is sufficient to think of satyagraha as a way of confronting an opponent with the idea of truth, which is being mobilized as part of a mass movement. Right? That's essentially what Gandhi is going to do when he comes up with the idea of satyagraha. This is something that is going to be. This is not something, by the way, that happens in the early years. He develops these ideas. It is only about halfway through his time in South Africa that he begins to really think of this idea of mass nonviolent resistance. And then over the course of the next decade, he's going to continue in that vein. He's going to leave in 1915 for India, in early 1915. Late 1914, after the outbreak of World War I, and he's going to arrive in India in early 1915. But before I finish the chapter on South Africa and come back to what Gandhi is going to do in India, I had mentioned to you at the outset that his career in South Africa is now viewed by some people as highly controversial. In what respects? Because, for example, some people have alleged that Gandhi was, in his own way, a racist. Why was he a racist? Because when he was advocating for the rights of the Indians, he did not pay any heed to the liabilities under which black people were suffering. Sometimes he used derogatory language, it has been argued, right, with respect to black people. There are people who have argued on the reverse that, well, in fact, actually the conditions on the ground in South Africa were so difficult to begin with that what Gandhi really had to do was to try to create some kind of solidarity among very diverse Indian communities. Before he could think about how he might possibly include black people within the struggle, right, that he had to first think about how he's going to address a very diverse group of Indians themselves, people who spoke, in fact, actually several different languages, for instance. Right? And then, of course, there are very complicated questions. I mean, what makes us think that if Gandhi had said that, well, I'm going to agitate for the rights of black people too, what makes us think even remotely that black people would have said, yeah, we accept you, an Indian, as our leader? Right? So forth and so on. So, as you can understand, this is, again, a rather very complicated, set of questions that we have. And we are not here to really do an assessment at this juncture of how Gandhi was successful or not in South Africa. Now, the main thing, as far as I'm concerned, is that having established who Gandhi is, and what are the kinds, so these are some of the kinds of grievances that the Indians Indians had. For example, the poll tax, disenfranchisement, that Indians, of course, could not vote. There were restrictions placed on them. You know, the question that had been asked, difficulties for Indian traders in getting licenses, because the Gujaratis are very competitive, and given the kind of extraordinary networks that they have in many places, it's been found out that once the Gujaratis monopolize that area, others find it very difficult to function. Of course, for white traders, the Gujaratis were becoming a problem, and that's one reason why they put obstacles in the way of Gujarati traders. Right? So these are some of the grievances we're talking about. Now, Gandhi is going to return to India early 1915. At this point, let us leave him aside for a second, because now I have to go back to the narrative of the emergence of the next phase of nationalism in India. All right, that's what we have to look at before we can go back to the question to what Gandhi himself is really doing at this juncture. Now, 1885, as I pointed out to you, is the year that the Congress is founded, and within 10 years, there was an awareness that, this form of petitioning the rulers, reminding them that, look, you had promised us liberty. You had promised us liberty of speech, of expression, and that many of these promises have not been kept by you. That Indians are being excluded from taking a part in governing their own country, so forth and so on. This is what I mean by the mode of petitioning. Within 10 years, there are some people who are beginning to argue that, well, this is not going to get us very far. We need to mobilize the masses, because thus far the masses have not been involved in this early phase of nationalism. Right? It's the educated elite. And one of the persons who's going to emerge as a major figure is a man called Bal Gangadhar Tilak. Right? So Tilak is from Western India, from the state adjoining Gujarat. He's from the state of Maharashtra, and he's an upper caste person, so he's a Brahmin, right? He's a Brahmin, and one of the things that Tilak is going to do, and that's really a stroke of genius on his part, is that he is going to say that, one way in which I can mobilize people, right? So what's happening here? What is he thinking? How do I bring the masses into politics? Right? And one way in which I can mobilize them is I can take a religious festival and give it a political slant. Right? So one of the festivals that he takes is what is called the Ganesh Utsav. Ganesh is, I'm sure at least a couple of you here would probably know, but he's an Hindu god, pot-bellied, elephant head, right? He is the god of auspiciousness, very often seen as an icon of wisdom as well. So very often, before you begin an enterprise, you invoke Ganesh. And in Maharashtra, this is the Ganpati festival is a major festival, And what they do in this festival is they build these images of Ganesh. The images can be as small as this, and they can be as tall as 20, 30 feet. All right, and then they take them in a procession, and then they immerse the image in a body of water. And I'm not talking about immersing one image. There may be thousands of images that might be immersed, right? So, but usually it's a procession. And what Tilak is going to do is he's going to use this festival as an occasion, because it's already brought together people. It's brought together people, right? He's going to use it as a platform for raising political awareness and political slogans. He's also the editor of a newspaper, the Kesari, which is a newspaper in Marathi. So he's a very learned man, and of course he's a lawyer. He's a lawyer, right, by training. So he's going to mobilize this festival. He's also going to revive an Indian political figure from the 17th century, a man known as Shivaji, right? Shivaji. He's going to revive the memory of Shivaji. Today, Shivaji is an icon in Maharashtra. And if you say something critical of Shivaji, watch out for your life. All right. So he is very often seen as a kind of a proto-nationalist figure, a person who was the person who engineered the renaissance of Hindu ideology. That's often how he is seen, right? And argued for resistance against the Mughal emperors of India in the 17th century. So what Tilak is going to do is he's going to politicize the masses through these two festivals, right? And this is going to begin in 1894 and 95. And one of the ways in which the British are going to react to him is, so if you look at 1898, eventually they're going to put him in jail. They're going to try him on charges of sedition. And here again, I want you to make a brief note of something I've mentioned to you before, namely the particular way in which the British very often dealt with their adversaries in this period of nationalism, particularly their learned adversaries. Tilak is a very learned man. And one of the things he's going to show, well, the British realize this quite often, but nonetheless they have to fall back on this idea of the political trial. What do they realize? That these adversaries are a match for them, right? Because what is it that Tilak is able to do in 1898 and Gandhi is going to be able to do when he's put on trial in 1922? They are going to be able to command the courtroom, right? They know the law. They know the language of the oppressor. In fact, they know it better than the oppressor. So if you read the transcript of the trial of Tilak or Gandhi, and you're going to read, by the way, what Gandhi said in his trial for next week, when he was tried in 1922, they have a command over the English language, and they have a command over the language of law. And they know that the courtroom is a spectacle. It is a theater, right? If you ever watched the OJ, trial when it was going on, now some of you wouldn't have because you weren't born then, but you've seen the TV proceedings and all of that, and now there's a Netflix serial. Well, that's exactly what it means. What is the nature of the courtroom? Right? The fact that they're lawyers, something I've mentioned repeatedly, is crucial. But what's also crucial is that the British say that, we are a people sworn to the idea of rule of law. Now, if we have a political adversary, we can't shoot the guy dead. We'd like to, privately they'll say, but we can't, because then we no longer are a people who represent the idea of the rule of law, right? Where's the notion of fair play? Where's the notion of justice? So let's give them their due in the courtroom. And of course, you know the outcome. You know the outcome always beforehand, that he's going to be convicted. Right? So he's going to be convicted. He gets Tilak in 1898. He's going to be given an 18-month jail sentence, and then he's going to be put on trial again later on as well, a second trial. However, let's go back. So 1894-95, the politicization of these festivals by Tilak. 1896, the bubonic plague spreads to India. Any idea how many people were killed over the course of the next several years? 15 million. 15 million. Now, that's a history, a chapter in the medical history of India, so to speak. The reason why I mention it here, not simply to indicate the extent of mortality, the reason I mention it is that, and this gets us into a number of complicated questions, is that when the plague begins to spread, the colonial state obviously says, well, we have an obligation to try to stop the plague from spreading. Right? What measures can we take? And one of the measures that they wanted to take was they wanted to basically, for example, in the city of Pune, right, which is a city where Tilak, and it's one of the citadels of Brahmin orthodoxy, right? Brahmin orthodoxy. So in the city of Pune in Western India, one of the measures that the British proposed to take was they wanted the inspectors working for the government to go to every home, because what you do is you isolate people who have the right. You go to every home. Now, if you go to every home, you are invading the interior space of a Hindu household. Right? And if you have Orthodox households where you say that our women have to be shielded from strange men, for example, right? The sanctity of the home, because in the material domain outside, as a people you are colonized by the British, but you still have the sanctity of your own home, right? I mean, if you had to put it in simple English, it's an invasion of your privacy, right? It's an invasion of your privacy. So when the British propose to do that and start to do that, it provokes enormous resistance, right? And one of the consequences of that is that in 1897 you begin to see the beginning of armed revolutionary violence in India. And one of the first political assassinations of a British official takes place in 1897 when a man called Rand, he's a British official, and he's going to be assassinated by the Chapekar brothers. Right? So they're just going to go up to him and they're going to shoot him dead. Right? And that's the beginnings of armed revolutionary violence. Now, I want to spend just a few minutes on this chapter, and then I'm going to drop it altogether, this armed revolutionary violence, because I can tell you that there is a school of thought among historians of India who argue that armed revolutionary violence was very important in the liberation of India. Right? These are people who have argued against the kind of conventional understanding, and on this occasion, at least, I wholly go along with the conventional understanding. Right? In most of my interpretations, I won't, but in this one, I do. What is the largely conventional understanding? That it was the Congress led by Gandhi that was principally instrumental in delivering India from colonial rule. Right? That this was the major impetus within nationalism, is the kind of mass nonviolent resistance movements that Gandhi was going to lead. There is a school of thought who have argued that no, armed revolutionary violence was very important. And the history of that going back, as I said, to roughly around 1897. Now, if you read the autobiographies of many of these armed revolutionaries, you find out that there were a number of problems that they had to think about. One was the access to arms. Because in India, after the rebellion of 1857-58, the British passed an Arms Act. And under the Arms Act, private ownership of arms was not permitted in India. Not permitted at all. So access to arms was not very easy. You know, when you had to gain access, it was usually you had to smuggle them in, or especially in the case of ammunition, bombs, they're largely homemade bombs, right? A precursor to what, if I may put it this way, the jihadis, sometimes have been doing, right? As it's very often, now they tell you that you can actually find, full instructions on how to make a big bomb on the internet, so forth and so on. Right? Well, they're following manuals too, by the way. These armed revolutionaries from late 1890s through the 1920s are following these manuals, and very often they would end up blowing up themselves up. When they're making a bomb, it just, if you read their autobiographies, you find that quite often. As many of them were killed making bombs as they killed the British, I can tell you that. That's one way to answer this school of thought which argues for the importance of armed revolutionary violence. But this is really very minuscule. It is very minuscule. It's just that two people committing an act of violence, killing a British official, are going to make a splash, right? Partly because the idea that any Indian would dare to do this was something that was really unfathomable to the British. So it certainly had that kind of impact. It had a kind of a sensationalist impact beginning in 1897. Right? Now, what's happening then? Right? If we have to just think about it, let's go to this and we'll return to the other slide. Circa 1900, what are we talking about? We're talking about the moderates who are still there, right? And the moderates are those who've been arguing for these piecemeal reforms. You know, they're liberals, largely anglicized elites. They want to work within the constitution. When I say constitution, I don't mean that India had a constitution, but what I mean is working within the legal framework that is available. That if you have a problem, you seek a redressal of your problem. What do? You submit a petition, right? So if you have a problem here on this campus and you want that problem addressed, what do? You write a letter to the dean or to the chancellor, right? That's working within the framework. Not extra-constitutional. Then you have the extremists. I put all of this in quotation marks because these were the terms that were used by the British to characterize them. So these extremists are those who are now advocates of revolutionary or armed violence. Tilak is going to fall in that group. Bal Gangadhar Tilak, the person about whom I spoke, the one who revived these religious festivals in part, right, and who is one of the people who brings in the masses into Indian politics. And these extremists are to be found largely in Bengal and in Maharashtra. Now, why those two places? Brief comment there. Bengal, because that is the seat of the British government. Right? So that's the seat of the British government, so resistance is going to be, and it is also going to be the place where, of course, the British presence had been most acutely felt, right, over the course of the 18th century going into the 19th century. Maharashtra, because it is the seat, some parts of Maharashtra, it is the seat of Brahmin orthodoxy. Right? So these upper caste Hindus who are highly agitated by the various ways in which the British have violated, right, their lives, their privacy, so forth and so on. Right? So those are the two. Now, Gandhi has not yet, 1900, Gandhi is in South Africa. And he's not even known in India at this point in time. He's not known really to anyone in India at this point in time, but he's going to eventually emerge. Here what I've given you is sort of a list. The top three are the most important for you to think about, and we haven't yet turned to the Muslim League. What is this organization when it gets founded in 1906? We're going to turn to that in just a few moments. And then you have the socialists and communists. And again, this is much later on. You're going to find this to be the case really in the 1920s, 1930s, and then the Hindu nationalists, including, for example, an organization such as the Hindu Mahasabha, which again is something that you'll find later on. Right? But these are the strands of nationalism. Yes, yeah.
You characterize Bhagat Singh as a socialist and a communist, and not under an extremist kind of label that he's using.
Yeah, because fundamentally his ideology is that of a socialist. That's why. Yeah, I mean, this doesn't mean, by the way, that there's no overlapping. There can be overlapping. I mean, someone like him, you could put him in the category of an extremist, which is what the British would have certainly advocated for. But remember that here, the moderates and extremists that I'm speaking about is circa more like 1900, when from the point of view of the British, it was clear that you have the moderates, and then you have these people who are turning to armed revolutionary violence, right? And circa 1900, Bhagat Singh wasn't even born, all right? So this is a scenario that we're talking about, circa 1900. Now, and we'll return to Gandhi later on, but what we have to think about is, where is now nationalism moving? All right. So 1905. So the Munda revolt I spoke about last time. That's the Birsa Munda was a tribal leader, right? So suppression of the Munda revolt. 1905. Two significant things. Three really effectively. All right. Because then if you look 1905-09, you find the Swadeshi movement. Three significant developments. First, the Russo-Japanese War. And some of you might think to yourself, what does that have to do with the narrative of Indian nationalism? It has a great deal to do with it. Because this war in 1905, where the Japanese defeated the Russian Imperial Navy, became a milestone in the history of Asian nationalism. I use the word Asian now, not Indian. All over Asia, the news of the Japanese victory over the Russians was received with enormous excitement. And it was because it demonstrated the capacity of an Asian power to defeat a European power. Right? That's what we. And if you read the pronouncements of Indian nationalists, Vietnamese nationalists, for example, you understand how important this was. That it loomed very large in their imagination. It showed that the white man was not invincible. Let's put it this way, right? And so this is going to really inspire a great many people in places like India, and we're going to find subsequently in places like Vietnam and so on. Right? Number two, the partition of Bengal. Now, the Bengal presidency was, as has been mentioned to you on numerous occasions, a very large area. A very large area. The British in 1905 said, we're going to partition it. We're going to cut Bengal. Right? And they claimed that they were doing it for the sake of administrative efficiency. That this place is ungovernable, it's really too large. Right? However, the matter is far more complex than that, and in fact, can be easily argued that it was not administrative efficiency that the British had in mind. Now, to understand why they decided to partition Bengal, we have to keep in mind two considerations. The first consideration, of course, is that, as is now transparent from the narrative thus far to you, that nationalism is now becoming a problem for the British. Now they're finally alert to the idea that, well, not every Indian there is going to simply be going around with a placard saying, Mr. Viceroy, please honor English notions of rule of law, and give us a little bit more liberty. No. There are some Indians who are going to resort to armed violence, and that means not just the political assassination of officials, but it means sabotaging British facilities. You sabotage railway lines, because that's the main line of communication for the British, right? You throw a bomb at a police station. Right? So there are acts of sabotage going on as well. And the British are now thinking that, well, we have to find a way to defang nationalism. We have to emasculate these nationalists. One way in which you emasculate it is perhaps by, in fact, actually partitioning the province. And how do you partition the province? Now, to understand that, let me remind you of something called the census. Right? Recall that the census started in 1871 and it takes place every 10 years. So then you have the census in 1881, 1891, 1901. Now, when the census of 1901 takes place, this is not a map of Bengal, but let's just imagine that Bengal was like this, right? And you say, okay, I'm going to partition it, right? So this becomes East Bengal, this becomes West Bengal. Right? Now it so happens, right, that East Bengal is largely Muslim. Okay? Largely. But that doesn't mean that there are no Hindus there. Of course there are. Right? But you could say it's Muslim majority. Muslim majority. And West Bengal is Hindu majority. So when they partition, it's very conveniently partitioned into what you might call Muslim Bengal and Hindu Bengal. That's how the partitioning is fundamentally done. Now, this brings us to the subject of communalism. All right, this is an exceedingly important subject, along with the whole question of nationalism, communalism. Ordinarily, if we had time, I would have done it in a Socratic manner. I would have said, well, you tell me what you think communalism is. But let me just tell you straight on what it is so that we can move along. Let me first tell you what it is not. It has nothing to do with the English word commune. You know, like the hippies lived in communes in the 1960s. No, it has nothing to do with that. Okay? This is a very particularly South Asian usage, really. You don't find that word used in most other contexts. In the United States, you would not really use it in the way in which it is used in India. So communalism is first and foremost an ideology. An ideology. This ideology stipulates, and I have spoken about this before, when I was talking about colonial India and I was talking about, for example, what did Warren Hastings do? Right? A code of law for the Hindus and a code of law for the Mohammedans or Muslims. Right? Separate civil codes for these two communities, the idea being that these are two very distinct communities. So the history of communalism, I am arguing, in fact goes back to the late 18th century. Right? So what is it? It's an ideology. This ideology insists that in India, the primordial element of a person's identity is religion. So if someone asked Vinay Lal who he is, Vinay Lal could say, well, I'm an Indian, I'm an Indian American, I'm male, I'm heterosexual, right? I'm brown-skinned, I'm a university professor, and the British official who believes in communalism will say, yes, but you haven't said what it is that really makes you Vinay Lal. There's only one thing that makes you that before everything else. You may be all of this, but the essential element of your identity is you are a Hindu, or a Muslim, or a Buddhist, whatever the case may be. Now, you could argue that, well, what's so exceptional about this? No, there is something highly exceptional about this, because someone could point to, I could point to, a number of people in this classroom and could say that, well, I don't know the religious faith of every person in this classroom, but I could say that, well, you also have a religion, right? Doesn't that define you? In some sense. Now, the British claim would be, yes, no, look, Christianity is important for people who are Christians in the US or Britain or France or Germany, or whatever the case may be. But it is not the constitutive primordial element of their identity. That before I am all of these other things, before I'm a university professor, before I'm a heterosexual or homosexual or whatever the case may be, before I am 50 other things, I am first a person of religion. In India, you are defined by your religion. Right? That is the essential building block of identity in the communal outlook. Now there are consequences, because this is not if you get a question asking you what is the communalist interpretation of Indian history, then you're going to have to go further along. How would you go further along? Because first you would say, well, the communalist interpretation of Indian history insists upon the idea that religion is the most crucial constitutive element in the constitution of identity in India. Right? The second step is that the communalist interpretation of Indian history insists that in India they are only collectivities, an idea that I have spoken to you about before. They're only collectivities. Now, when they're only collectivities, it means that all Hindus will gravitate towards other Hindus, and all Muslims will gravitate towards other Muslims. right? They'll all gravitate towards other Muslims. So Hindus become one block. Now, there could be 5,000 types of Hindus, but they're all Hindus. That becomes a block. And then the Muslims become a block. Then the communalist interpretation argues, because it's an ideology, right? It argues that the nature of Indian history is that these communities have always been in conflict with each other. They've always been in conflict with each other. And this is where, of course, now that you have some idea about such things as Orientalism, for example, right, this is where you have to start thinking, well, what is really going on? Because look, and here again, I'm really taking shortcuts, because we have to ensure that we get to the fundamental, narrative, back to the fundamental narrative. Right? The shortcut here is that the communalist interpretation of Indian history, which is really a colonial reading of Indian history, is largely dictated by Europe's understanding of its own history. Because what was the history of Europe in the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th centuries? It's religious war, basically, right? What is the Protestant Reformation? And the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, the violent disputes, right? This is the past of Europe. Now the implication for the British is very clear, that when they come to India, from their point of view, it's impossible that Hindus and Muslims could possibly have inhabited the same place and lived peacefully. They view that as a sheer impossibility. And I have a kind of a formulaic way of putting it. I think I've mentioned that to you before too, but even if whether I have or not, I'll mention it again, because it's a really easy way to grasp what the British view as a difference between the Hindus and the Muslims. They say that the Hindu loves to worship the cow. The cow is sacred. And the Muslim loves to eat the cow. Loves to eat the cow. Right? That's one way in which they'll say, well, these are people whose histories are completely separate, right? And they're bound to be in conflict. And of course, this is going to be very important, because when independence begins to loom large, the argument is going to be that, well, 25% of the population of undivided India is Muslims. Are they going to be prepared to live under a Hindu tyranny? That's the British claim, which is a claim that is going to be accepted by some Muslims, of course, right? That if we leave, it can only be the tyranny of the Hindus on the Muslims, because they are the majority. This is also, by the way, a different problem, which unfortunately I cannot enter into at all. That is this whole problem of minority and majority, why we think in these ways. Because this is a very modern way of thinking about communities. It's a modern form of what I call political arithmetic. Majority, minority. That's not how people always thought of themselves, right? Historically speaking, in many parts of the world. But this is how it's going to be. So when they partition Bengal, now let's go back to that narrative. The partitioning is very conveniently, right, along religious lines. Because what are they trying to do? They are now trying to create a division. They're going to essentially say, the Muslims in the eastern part of Bengal, they have their own history, they have their own identity, they have their own culture, right? And the Hindus in the western part of Bengal have their own history, identity, and culture. And it is going to be resisted. The partition will be resisted. I mean, that shows you the force of the anti-communalist sentiment. I have to simplify here, of course, because there were many strands that went into what is called the Swadeshi movement. So this resistance to the partition of Bengal gives rise to what is called the Swadeshi movement. What does the word Swadeshi mean? Right? Swadesh. The roots are swa, meaning one's own, desh, meaning country or nation. If you go to village India, by the way, you find out that the word desh means not just country and nation. It just simply means my area, my locality, my village. You know, हमारे देश में ऐसा होता है doesn't mean, if a person says that to you, doesn't mean that they're saying this is how it happens in my country. This is just how it happens in my neighborhood or my area, you know, right? But the word desh means country or nation. So the Swadeshi movement was a movement that is going to advocate self-reliance, self-help, Atma Shakti. Atma Shakti is Atma means soul. Soul. Shakti is energy. Usually shown in the form of a goddess, personified, I should say, as a goddess. Energy is female, you know, right? So the Atma Shakti is where you learn to build up your soul, right? Where you become self-reliant. Now, self-reliance had a material aspect to it as well. The material aspect of it entailed a great many things. For example, the boycott of British goods. So very often they would have these bonfires. So, you know, all the people, men in the neighborhood, for example, would be told, you know, if you're wearing a shirt that's been stitched in Britain, take it off and throw it into the bonfire, right? So this is because, of course, then this is going to lead to the whole campaign for, you know, what you might call what is called khadi, and this is Gandhi is going to lead that campaign. Eventually, we're going to find in a very big way, right? But cloth that is woven at home, for example, right? So you move away from manufactured goods, including such things. For example, there were many experiments that were conducted in how to make soap, because soap used to be imported into India from Britain, you know. And so how would you have Swadeshi soap, as it was called? So boycott of British goods, withdrawal from British-run or British-aided schools and colleges, and right. So all these colleges that the Hindu college that we were talking about, you know, Presidency College as it became, all of these institutions and a great many, the call was that Indian students should withdraw from these, and some people started running what were called national schools, right? A stress on village improvement. And in the Swadeshi movement, what you're going to find now is, remember, this is happening in Bengal. What Tilak had been doing was in Maharashtra. Now, I want you to remember that, because thus far what we are seeing is that in Maharashtra, the masses have now started to emerge into politics because Tilak has been mobilizing them. But the emergence of the masses is not a nationwide phenomenon. It's not a nationwide phenomenon. Similarly, the Swadeshi movement is confined largely to Bengal, to the eastern part of the country. But what you do have is now you have a mass movement that's emerged in the Western India, you have a mass movement that's emerged in Eastern India, right? And there were a great many other elements, of course, to the Swadeshi movement. If you look at the last one, their refusal to pay taxes, especially land revenues, right? All of these elements are going to be crucial in the emergence of a kind of movement of self-reliance, which is known as Swadeshi movement, which drew in the major intellectual figures of India, of Bengal at that time. The consequence of the Swadeshi movement is that the British revoke the partition of Bengal. They put it back together, right? Because it's a mass movement, and what it really does in many ways is it paralyzes the British administration in a number of places. So day-to-day governance becomes exceedingly difficult. One last question, yes.
So the movement involved both Hindus and Muslims?
Very good question. There is a substantial literature on this. Some people have argued it was really largely Hindus, right? Some people have argued that, well, there was a presence of Muslims, but it was largely nominal, right? Largely nominal. So, but it's a complicated question. And again, one way of rephrasing the question is, was it suffused with Hindu symbols, for example? Right? Was it suffused with Hindu symbols? Even the word Swadeshi, right? I mean, this is the roots are Sanskritic, you know. So was it able to draw on the Muslims or not? Was this an agitation that was largely, you know, by the Hindus? Right? So important question. What the consequence is that in 1909, 1910, what we're going to find is that the British are going to say that, well, you know, the Swadeshi movement lasts 1909. The British are going to make an announcement shortly thereafter saying that they're going to revoke, you know, the partition. But I have to, of course, as I've insisted thus far, right, that one reason for this was not simply to create this Hindu-Muslim divide, so to speak, by having the partition. But the whole idea was that Bengal itself has become a hotbed of nationalism. We need to find really a way, right, to defang this movement, to emasculate it in some fashion. Right? All right? So this is where we are thus far when we're looking at the Swadeshi movement. Now, to continue with the next element of this story, 1906, while the Swadeshi movement is going on, an organization is going to be founded called the Muslim League. Right? Now, the whole idea behind the founding of the Muslim League was the notion that the Indian National Congress could not represent all Indians. This was the British claim. The Congress, I have to say, never saw itself as a Hindu organization. Of course, in the early years, I mean, I'm talking about the very early years, 1885, moving on to about 1890s, the membership was comprised of people who were, as I said, anglicized elites for the most part. There were many Hindus, but there were Parsis, right? The Parsis are Zoroastrians, you know, right? There were a number of Englishmen who were present in the Indian National Congress, right? Or Britishers, I should say. Right? So, so the membership is fairly wide. The Congress, all the way until the 1930s, 1940s, in fact, until the advent of independence in 1947, never accepted the claim that it represented only the Hindus. It always stood by the idea that it represented all Indians. However, the establishment of the Muslim League in 1906 clearly suggests that at least some section of Muslims were beginning to take the view that the Congress did not represent them. And we do know, by the way, that the Muslim League, when it was founded in 1906, was founded with the active encouragement and instigation of the British. I mean, the evidence there is absolutely overwhelming that it was in fact actually encouraged. The Muslim leaders were taken aside by the British and told essentially what I mentioned to you before, namely, are you prepared to accept the idea of having to live perhaps sometime in the foreseeable future? 1906, no British is thinking that the writing is on the wall. In 40 years we're going to be out, you know, right? But do you want to even remotely consider the idea of living under Hindu tyranny, right? Do the Hindus really speak for you? Of course, you could ask yourself as a third party, how do the British claim to speak for anyone at all, right? And that, of course, is the whole theory of transcendence, that we transcend all these conflicts and differences. You know, we are above all of this. You know, the whole British monarchy is based on that idea. I hope you understand the deep-seated implications of the idea of transcendence. Right? Why is it that Britain has a monarch even today? You know, this queen who refuses to die, and her poor little boy has been waiting, you know, for 50 years or 30 years to ascend to the throne, and she just keeps on going day after day. right, shopping at Marks and Spencer, right? She represents the idea of transcendence. That's the difference between the state and the government, right? The British government is led by the Prime Minister, but she represents the crown, and the whole idea of the crown is that whatever the differences between the Tories and the Liberals, right, or the Labour Party, or whatever remains of that thing called the Labour Party, right, whatever the difference is, the Queen is above all of this. We transcend. The British are claiming in India we transcend all the differences. The only way a Hindu and a Muslim can be brought to the table together is because of us, you know, right? That is going to be the theory of transcendence. And I'm going to tell you a story going to 1947, just so that you understand what the implications of this are. 1947, when India is going to become partitioned, they have to decide what? How are they going to draw the line? Now we're not talking about partitioning a province. So this is India, and here is Muslim majority area, and here is Muslim majority here, okay, right? That's portion of Bengal, portion of Punjab. You have to draw a line. How do you draw the line? Where do you draw the line? Where do you say this is where? So you draw the line here. This is all India. This is now going to be a state called Pakistan. Who is the person who drew the line? The person who drew the line was a man called Sir Cyril Radcliffe. And his chief qualification for being the arbiter was that he had never been to India. And he positively loathed India, despised it. Right? Why is he brought? Because the idea is he, the Britisher sitting there, is the only one who can be neutral, fully neutral. Even an English official who has lived in India for 30 years may not be fully neutral. Why? Because the Hindu will be saying something in his right ear, the Muslim will be saying something in his left ear. And this is the nature of the natives. They will pollute you, contaminate you. You know, if you've lived among the natives for 30 years, you will get contaminated and polluted, right? You will not value the truth as much. But this man, Radcliffe, who loathes and despises India, has never been there, he's going to be sent a summons. Can you please come to India? And he's going to spend less than a month deciding the fortune and fate of 300 million people when he draws the line. You know, right? Why? Because he transcends. He's a figure of transcendence. That's the importance of the idea. Now we're out of time. We'll have to continue with this. We'll come back to Gandhi, of course, in my next lecture.